In the British Museum, in a climate-controlled case in Gallery 56, there is a clay tablet roughly the size of a human hand. Its catalogue number is BM 78941. It was pressed into shape sometime around 1635 BCE, more than 3,600 years ago, in a city called Sippar, in a region that is now southern Iraq. The writing on it is cuneiform, small wedge-shaped marks made by a reed stylus pushed into wet clay. And what it describes is the creation of the first human being. The tablet is part of the Atrahasis Epic. The most complete copy of this text was written by a scribe named Epic Aya, whose name appears in the colophon, the ancient equivalent of a byline, and according to that text, the being who shaped the first human body, who mixed the clay with the blood of a sacrificed god, who pinched off the pieces, who set them in 2 rows of 7, who performed the ritual that brought life into existence, was not a king, was not a male deity acting alone, was a goddess. Her name was Ninhursag. She was, in the oldest written records we possess, one of the 4 most powerful deities in the entire Sumerian pantheon, listed alongside Anu, the god of the sky, Enlil, the god of the wind, and Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. She was called the Mother of the Gods. She was called the Lady of the Sacred Mountain. She was called, after the creation of humanity, the mistress of all the gods. The assembled deities kissed her feet, and then, over the course of roughly 1,000 years, she was quietly removed from her own story. Not through a single dramatic event, not through a war in heaven or a mythological coup, through something more subtle and in many ways more effective. Her position in the formal lists of the gods was lowered, generation by generation. Her identity was fragmented, split across more than a dozen different names, each one easier to sideline than the whole. The creation narratives were rewritten, and in the new versions, a male god did the work alone. By the time the Babylonian Enuma Elish was being recited in temples during the 12th century BCE, the goddess who had shaped humanity was simply absent. Her role had been given to Marduk. Her name had been replaced, but the older tablets survived. They survived because clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, does not burn easily. When cities were sacked and libraries were torched, the fires often hardened the tablets rather than destroying them. What the conquerors meant to obliterate they accidentally preserved, and in the 20th century scholars began to read those older tablets. A Danish-born Assyriologist named Thorkild Jacobsen, working at the University of Chicago and later at Harvard, traced the evolution of Mesopotamian religion across millennia. An American Assyriologist named Samuel Noah Kramer translated the Sumerian literary texts that told her story, and what emerged from their work was a picture of a goddess who had been systematically moved from the centre to the margins of the oldest written religious tradition on earth. Tonight we are going to tell that story. All of it, from the beginning. Let yourself settle in. Let the lights go low. Let the weight of the day begin to fall away. Close your eyes if you like. You do not need to see anything for this story to work. You only need to listen. Because this is a story that has been waiting more than 4,000 years to be heard in full, and tonight you're going to hear it. To understand what happened to Ninhursag, we first need to understand the world she came from, not our world. A world so ancient that the very concept of writing had only just been born. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, what is now modern-day Iraq. Roughly 7,000 years ago, before the pyramids existed, before Stonehenge was erected, before the first Egyptian pharaoh drew breath, a civilization was forming in the marshlands and alluvial plains of this region that would change everything. Imagine the landscape, not the parched desert you might picture when someone says Iraq. In the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, southern Mesopotamia was a world of water and reed. The 2 rivers spread across the flat plains in a shifting web of channels, lagoons and seasonal lakes. The marshes extended for miles. Thick stands of giant reeds, some reaching 20 feet in height, their root systems creating a floating world of green above the slow-moving water. Fish teemed in the shallows. Waterbirds nested in clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and growing things and the faint sulphuric tang of the marshes. It was here, on the alluvial plains and along the edges of the marshlands, that the first settlements appeared. The Sumerians did not call themselves Sumerians. That name came later, from the Akkadians. The Sumerians called themselves the Black-Headed People, and they called their land Kiengi, the place of the civilized lords. They developed the first system of writing, cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus cut from the marshes that surrounded their cities. They built the first cities. They organized the first complex irrigation systems. They created the first legal codes, and they wrote the first stories. These stories were not fiction in the way we understand the word. They were explanatory frameworks, attempts to describe how the world worked, why things were the way they were, and what forces governed the lives of human beings. The Sumerians recorded these stories on clay tablets, and those tablets were stored in temple archives and royal libraries, thousands upon thousands of them. And on those preserved tablets, over and over again, one name appears with a frequency and prominence that scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries found striking: Ninhersag. In the oldest texts we possess, texts from the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2334 BCE, she's listed among the most powerful gods in the entire Sumerian pantheon. The earliest Sumerian literature of the 3rd millennium BCE identifies 4 primary deities: Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag. The Sumerians also spoke of 7 gods who decree: An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana, Utu, and Inanna, though the precise arrangement of the top tier could vary by time period and location. What is consistent across the earliest records is that Ninhursag was there, at the top, not as an add-on, not as a consort mentioned in passing, as a full member of the highest tier of divine authority. She was described by Britannica, drawing on the work of Jacobson and others, as equal in rank to An and Enlil, the goddess of stony ground, the near mountain ranges, and the desert wildlife. She was also the goddess of birth. Let that sit for a moment. Before we talk about what happened to her, we need to understand what she was. Before we meet Ninhursag in the texts, it helps to understand the physical world she inhabited, because the Sumerians did not separate their gods from their geography. The gods lived in cities. They had addresses. Their temples were rebuilt on the same spot century after century, each one rising on the rubble of the last, growing upward like the layers of a living thing. The oldest of these cities, according to the Sumerians themselves, was Eridu. Eridu sits today as a mound called Tel Abu Shahrain, about 20 kilometers southwest of the ruins of Ur, in Iraq's Dekar Governorate. It is one of the most ancient permanent settlements in human history. Archaeological evidence places its founding around 5400 BCE, during the early Ubaid period, when the Persian Gulf shoreline lay much closer than it does today. In 1946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar, assisted by the British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, began the first major excavation at Eridu. What they found beneath the mound stunned them. Digging beneath the ruins of an unfinished ziggurat from the 3rd millennium BCE, they uncovered 18 distinct layers of occupation, 18 levels of habitation, one built on top of another, stretching back over 3,000 years. And threaded through those layers were the remains of 6 successive temples, each built on the same sacred spot, each larger than the last. The earliest of those temples, level 16, was a simple mud brick shrine resting on virgin sand. It measured roughly 12 by 15 feet. Inside was a podium that may have served as an altar, and a niche that probably held a statue. Scattered on the floor around the altar, the archaeologists found fish bones and ash, the remains of offerings. Someone, roughly 7,400 years ago, had brought fish from the marshes and laid them before whatever power they believed resided in this small room. By the 10th rebuilding, that modest shrine had evolved into a recognizable Sumerian temple, a tripartite plan with a long central chamber, flanked by symmetrical side rooms, built on a raised platform. The pattern that would define Mesopotamian sacred architecture for the next 3,000 years had already established itself. Eridu was sacred to Enki, the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of the subterranean aquifer. He would become Ninhursag's counterpart and, in the myths, her partner in creation. But before the myths were written, before the gods had names that scribes pressed into clay, the impulse to build and rebuild on sacred ground was already ancient. The Sumerians understood something that archaeologists would only appreciate millennia later. The power of a place does not come from the building that stands on it. It comes from the continuity, the knowledge that this patch of earth has been sacred for so long that no living person can remember its beginning. This is the world Ninhursag came from, a world where temples grew like geological formations, layer upon patient layer. A world where the rivers shifted and the marshes spread and the cities rose from the mud and sank back into it and rose again. Nothing about this world moved quickly, and the goddess who presided over it was accordingly patient beyond human comprehension. One of the most unusual features of Ninhursag's identity in the Sumerian record is how many names she carried. This is not typical of minor deities. A minor god might have one name and one function. Ninhursag had over a dozen names, each corresponding to a different role, a different aspect of her authority. And each of those names appeared in different tablets, different cities, different periods. Ninhursag itself means Lady of the Sacred Mountain. The Sumerian word Nin translates to lady or queen, and Hursag means mountain or foothill. In Sumerian cosmology, the mountain was not merely geography, it was a sacred concept, the meeting point between the sky and the underworld, the axis around which reality turned. To be the lady of the sacred mountain was to be the goddess who presided over the boundary between worlds, but she was also called Ninmah, which means the great lady or the exalted queen. She was called Nintu or Nintur, meaning lady of the birthing hut, the Sumerian word tur referring both to the physical structure where births took place and to the womb itself. As Nintur, she was the patroness of every act of bringing life into the world. Every mother who went into labour in ancient Sumer did so under her protection. She was called Ki, meaning the earth itself, not a goddess of the earth. The earth? This identification appears in some of the oldest theological texts, where Ki is associated with the generative force of the land, the power that makes seeds grow and rivers flow and seasons turn. She was called Mami, a name that resonates with the word mama found in dozens of unrelated languages around the world. Most linguists attribute this cross-linguistic pattern to the natural sounds infants produce. But the resonance between the oldest name for the mother goddess and the first word most children speak is, at the very least, worth sitting with. She was called Aruru, particularly in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where she is invoked to create the wild man Enkidu. She was called Belet Ili, the Lady of the Gods, in Akkadian texts. She was called Dingirma, the exalted deity. She was called Shasuru, the womb goddess. She was called Damgal Nuna, the great wife of the prince. No other deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon accumulated this many titles. And the titles were not random variations. Each one encoded a specific function, a specific domain of power. Together they describe a figure whose authority touched every aspect of existence. Birth, death, healing, creation, judgment, sovereignty, and the very structure of the physical world. The scholar Tikva Frima Kensky, in her landmark study in the wake of the goddesses, made an observation about this proliferation that would prove prophetic. Having many names can be a sign of importance, but it can also, paradoxically, become a mechanism for dissolution. If one identity is split into a dozen fragments, it becomes easier to diminish each fragment individually. It is easier to quietly retire Nintu from the god lists, or to demote Ninmah to a secondary role, than to directly confront the full weight of Ninhursag's authority. We will see that mechanism in action later. For now, what matters is this. The goddess whose position was quietly lowered in the divine hierarchy was not a minor figure. She was one of the most powerful entities in the oldest written religious tradition in human history, and she was about to be given the single most important task those gods would ever face. To understand the creation of humanity in Sumerian mythology, you have to understand what the world looked like before humans existed, because the Sumerians had a very specific answer to this question, and it is not the answer most people expect. Before humans, the gods worked. This is one of the most distinctive features of the Mesopotamian worldview. In many later religious traditions, the creation of humanity is framed as an act of love or of divine self-expression. The Sumerians saw it differently. According to the Atrahasis Epic, with its most complete surviving copy written by the scribe epic Aya around 1635 BCE, now housed at the British Museum, there was a time when the gods themselves performed all the labour required to maintain the cosmos. The great gods, the Anunnaki, sat above and directed. The lesser gods, the Igigi, dug the canals, tilled the fields, dredged the rivers. They did the physical work of keeping the world alive, and they hated it. The text describes their suffering vividly. The opening line, as translated by Benjamin Foster, reads, When the gods were man, they did forced labour, they bore drudgery. For an immense span of time the Agigi laboured. They dug the riverbeds of the Tigris and the Euphrates. They piled earth into levees. They maintained the irrigation channels that allowed the marshlands to flourish. And eventually they broke. Imagine it. The gods themselves, covered in the same silty mud that caked the hands of every Sumerian canal worker. The gods burning their tools and marching on the house of Enlil, the lord of the atmosphere, the one who had assigned them their labours, the gods refusing, the gods demanding relief. If you have ever worked until your body could not take another day, if you have ever felt the bone-deep exhaustion that comes not from a single bad shift, but from months or years of unrelenting labour, then you already understand the emotional core of this story. The Sumerians built it into the foundation of their cosmology. The world exists because beings were exhausted. Humanity was created not from divine love but from divine need. Enlil was furious. He wanted the rebels punished. But Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, always the diplomat, always the schemer, proposed a different solution. Do not destroy them, Enki said. Create something else. Create a new being. A being that will carry the burden of the gods. A being that will dig the canals and tend the fields and offer the sacrifices. Create a workforce. The assembly of the gods agreed, but the question immediately arose. Who will do the creating? Enki had the plan. He was the architect. He was the one with the intellect, the one who understood the design. But the tablets are explicit about what happened next. Enki did not create humanity alone. He could not create humanity alone. He needed a partner. He needed Ninhursag. What follows is one of the most remarkable passages in all of ancient literature. It is not a vague, poetic description of creation. It reads, as many scholars have noted, almost like a laboratory report. And in it, Ninhursag is not an assistant. She is the co-creator. In some passages, she is the primary architect. The Atrahasis tablet tells us that a god named Gesh-2e, whose name means ear or wisdom, described in the text as a god who had intelligence, was sacrificed. His blood was mixed with clay. The symbolism is precise. The raw material comes from the body of the earth, which is Ninhursag's domain. The activating element, the divine blood, comes from the sacrificed god, and the shaping is done by the two of them together. But notice who holds the mould. The tablet describes Nintu, that is Ninhursag in her aspect as the birth goddess, mixing the clay with the blood and the flesh of the slain god. She shapes the mixture. She pinches off 14 pieces and sets 7 to her left and 7 to her right. A brick is placed between them. This is a ritual action, a formal act of creation, and she is the one performing it. The 14 pieces become 7 pairs, 7 males and 7 females. The first human beings, already divided into 2 sexes, already plural, not a single man in a garden, a community. The text then says something remarkable. The assembled gods watched. They praised her, and they gave her a new name after she finished mixing the clay. After she completed the first act of human creation, the great gods approached her. They ran to her. They kissed her feet, and they said, "Formerly we used to call you Mummy. Now let your name be Belet Kala Ili, mistress of all the gods. Consider that." After the creation of humanity, the gods themselves elevated her title. They acknowledged that what she had done placed her above them. She had made something no other god could make. She had given form to life. The Enki and Ninmah tablet, preserved primarily on tablets excavated from Nippur and now housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, provides a different but complementary account. In this version, Enki's mother Nama urges him to create a being to relieve the gods. Enki devises the plan, but instructs Nama to shape the clay from the top of the Abzu, with Ninmah, that is Ninhursag, acting as the essential partner, assisted by birth goddesses. The Akkadian texts use the term Lulu for this created being. The mixed one, the blended creature, part clay, part divine blood, part earthly material, and part something sacred. And across both the Atrahasis and the Enki and Ninmah accounts, the physical shaping of this being is consistently attributed to the mother goddess. What happened after the creation, the drunken competition between the two gods that tested the limits of what creation could achieve, we will come to shortly. But for now, what matters is this. In the oldest written creation accounts we possess, the being who gave physical form to humanity was female. If the creation of humanity was Ninhursag's greatest act, the myth of Dilmun is perhaps the most revealing portrait of her character. Because in Dilmun, we see not just her power, but her complexity, her tenderness, her fury, her willingness to destroy what she loved when it betrayed her trust, and her capacity to heal even when healing seemed impossible. Dilmun was the Sumerian paradise, the oldest paradise story in the world, older than Eden by at least 1,000 years. The tablet that describes it was found at Nippur and dates to approximately 2000 BCE, though the story itself is certainly far older. Dilmun, according to the tablet, was a place where there was no sickness, no death, no old age. The raven did not cry there. The lion did not kill. The wolf did not seize lambs. There was no widowhood, no wailing, no grief. It was in every sense a place of perfect peace. But it lacked one thing: water. The land was bright and pure, but nothing grew. The rivers did not flow, the wells were dry, and so the goddess of Dilmun turned to Enki and asked him to bring water to this parched world. Enki answered. He ordered the sun god Utu to bring fresh water up from the depths of the earth, and the water came, rivers appeared, wells bubbled up, the bitter waters turned sweet, crops sprang from the soil, the land of Dilmun became a garden. It was in this garden that Enki and Ninhursag became lovers, and from their union, 9 days later, each day representing 1 month of human gestation, a daughter was born. Ninsa, the Lady of Vegetation. But what follows in the myth is darker. Enki, driven by an insatiable desire, pursued their daughter Ninsa as well, and when Ninsa bore a daughter, Ninkura, Enki pursued her too, and then Ninkura bore a daughter named Utu, the goddess of weaving, and Enki pursued Utu. When Ninhursag learned what had happened, she intervened. She went to Utu and helped her remove Enki's seed from her body. She took the seed and buried it in the earth of Dilmun. From that buried seed, 9 days later, 8 plants grew, luscious and strong. The first 8 plants in the world, each one a different species, each one carrying within it the potential for nourishment and healing. Ninhursag was overjoyed. She declared these plants her children, born from her stony womb. She began the process of naming them, of assigning each one its destiny and its purpose. But before she could finish, Enki returned. Walking through the garden with his two-faced vizier Isimud, he came upon the 8 plants. He asked Isimud what they were. One by one, Isimud identified them, and one by one Enki ate them, all 8. He consumed the plants that Ninhursag had created from her own body. He ate them without asking, without permission, without understanding what they were or what they were meant to become. When Ninhursag discovered what Enki had done, her response was absolute. She cursed him. She turned upon him what the tablet calls the eye of death. She said, "Until he is dead, I shall not look upon him with the eye of life." And then she left. She departed from Dilmun, from the world, from the sight of the gods. Without Ninhursag, Enki began to die. 8 of his organs failed, 1 for each plant he had consumed. His jaw ached, his teeth ached, his mouth, his throat, his limbs, his ribs, his side. He lay in the dust of Dilmun, wasting away, and not a single god in the entire pantheon could heal him. Because only Ninhursag could heal. Only she had the power to draw sickness from the body and replace it with life. The other gods panicked. They sent messengers. They wept. They pleaded. Finally, a clever fox, the only creature willing to venture into the wilderness, found Ninhursag and persuaded her to return. She came back, and she did what no other being could do. She sat beside Enki. She asked him to name each place where his body hurt, and for each part he named, she birthed a new deity, a healing deity made specifically to cure that particular ailment. From his jaw, a goddess. From his tooth, another. From his rib, and here is where the ancient wordplay becomes extraordinary. She birthed a goddess called Ninti. In Sumerian, the word ti'ad means both rib and to make live. So Ninti is both the lady of the rib and the lady who makes live. 2 meanings in one name. One of the oldest puns in human literature, and if that sounds familiar, it should. Because the biblical story of Eve, created from Adam's rib and named the mother of all living, carries within it a trace of this far older story, a trace that the great Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer was among the first to identify and publish. The connection does not mean that the Bible directly copied the Sumerian myth. The relationship between these traditions is far more complex, but the oldest version of this story, the version written down first, on clay, in cuneiform, centres not on a male god creating a woman from a rib, but on a female goddess healing a male god and birthing life from his suffering. The directionality is reversed. In the oldest version, the woman is not the one who emerges from the man. The woman is the one who saves him. Among the 8 healing deities Ninhursag brought forth to cure Enki's broken body, one has a legacy that stretches in its own quiet way from the marshlands of ancient Sumer to the present hour. Her name was Ninkasi. According to the myth, Ninkasi was born to heal the pain in Enki's mouth. Her name, as used in the Dilmun myth, plays on the Sumerian word ka, meaning mouth. She was one of Ninhursag's children, born in a moment of compassion, shaped to mend what had been damaged. But Ninkasi would go on to become something more, the Sumerian goddess of beer. A hymn dedicated to her, written down around 1800 BCE, though certainly much older, survives on 3 known tablets, 1 from Nippur, 2 from unknown locations. The translation published by Miguel Civil of the University of Chicago in 1964 reveals that the hymn begins by naming Ninkasi's parentage and, remarkably, her caretaker. She was, the hymn says, given birth by the flowing water and tenderly cared for by Ninhersag. The mother goddess, the same goddess who shaped humanity from clay, raised the goddess of beer. The detail is small. It occupies only the opening lines of the hymn, but it tells us something about how the Sumerians understood their divine world. Ninhursag was not merely a creator of cosmic beings. She was, in the mythological record, someone who cared for children, who tended the small newly born gods she had brought into being, who was invoked in the context of a hymn about fermentation and barley and the rising of sweetwort as a figure of nurture. The hymn itself describes the brewing process in language that is simultaneously sacred and practical. Ninkasi bakes the beer bread in a big oven. She waters the earth-covered malt. She soaks it in a jar. The waves rise, the waves fall. She spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats. She pours out the filtered beer, and it flows, the hymn says, like the onrush of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Beer was not a luxury in Sumer. It was a staple, consumed daily by workers, offered to the gods in temple rituals, shared at banquets and celebrations. As the summerologist Chris Woods of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute has noted, beer production likely predates the first cities, perhaps by thousands of years. There are thousands upon thousands of references to beer in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, and yet, as Woods has observed, not a single unambiguous recipe. The hymn to Ninkasi is the closest thing that has been found. In 1989, Fritz Maytag of the Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco, working with anthropologist Solomon Katz of the University of Pennsylvania, attempted to recreate Sumerian beer based on the hymn. The result was cloudy, effervescent, and faintly dated, a drink that would have been unrecognisable to most modern beer drinkers, but that connected, however tenuously, across 4,000 years to the marshlands where the barley grew and the reed mats dried in the Mesopotamian sun. What matters for our story is not the beer itself, but the lineage. Ninkasi was born from Ninhursag. The goddess of beer was a child of the goddess of creation, and the hymn that praised her began with the name of her divine mother. Even in a text about fermentation, Ninhursag's presence endured. There is a passage in the Enki and Ninmah tablet that deserves close attention, because it is in many ways the most psychologically revealing episode in all of Sumerian mythology. It is the moment when the 2 most creative beings in the universe, the god of wisdom and the goddess of the earth, sit across from each other and compete. The tablet tells us that after the successful creation of humans there was a banquet. The gods celebrated. They drank beer, because as we now know, the Sumerians took their brewing seriously and the gods were no exception. In the course of the celebration, Ninhursag and Enki grew boastful. They began to argue about which of them was the more essential creator, and so they devised a test. Ninhursag went first. She took clay from the Abzu and began to shape beings, but these were not ordinary beings. She deliberately created them with impairments, 6 of them in total, each with a specific condition that would challenge its ability to function in the world. A man whose hands shook and could not grasp, a man who could not see, a man with paralyzed feet, a man who could not control his urine, a woman who could not give birth, a being with neither male nor female organs, the The challenge to Enki was this. For each being Ninhursag created, he had to find a purpose, a role, a place in society. He had to prove that no matter what she made, his wisdom could find a use for it. And he did. One by one, Enki examined the beings Ninhursag had shaped, and found a place for each of them. The man whose hands could not grasp, he placed in the king's service, a servant who could never steal. The blind man he made into a musician. The man with paralyzed feet he set to work as a silversmith. For each imperfection Ninhursag introduced, Enki found a corresponding function. His wisdom was equal to her creativity. Then it was Enki's turn. He too took clay and began to shape. He created a being, the tablet calls it Umul, that was so fundamentally impaired, so profoundly limited, that Ninhursag could not find a purpose for it. The being could not eat bread, could not stand, could not sit, could not do any of the things that the Sumerian understanding of a functional life required. Ninhursag tried. She offered it bread. It could not eat. She offered it a role. It could not perform. She was, for the first and only time in the mythological record, defeated. The overall narrative presents them as equals who have tested each other's limits. Neither is subordinate to the other. But what makes this passage extraordinary is what it reveals about the Sumerian understanding of creation, and of difference. The beings that Ninhursag creates with impairments are not discarded. They are given roles. This suggests a worldview in which the community was expected to find a place for every kind of person. Creation was understood not as a single, perfect act, but as messy, experimental, involving two forces arguing, pushing each other to the limits of their abilities. The passage has drawn multiple scholarly readings. Some see it as a reflection on disability in Sumerian society. Others, including Frymacensky, see in the competition a reflection of real tensions between the authority of the mother goddess tradition and the rising influence of the wisdom god tradition, an early sign of the shift that would eventually displace Ninhursag from her position of equality. But perhaps its deeper significance is more personal than political. Here, in the oldest creation story, the act of making is shown to be imperfect. The creators disagree about what constitutes success. The boundary between a meaningful life and a meaningless one is not clear-cut. It depends on who is looking, and what they value, and whether the community is willing to make room. This is not the creation story most of us grew up with, but it may be the most honest one. Before the Sumerians invented writing, before they built the first cities, before they composed the first myths that would be pressed into clay, they made figurines. These figurines, excavated from sites across southern Mesopotamia and dating to the al-Ubaid period, which stretched from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, are small clay sculptures depicting female forms. They are not realistic portraits. They are stylized, emphasizing certain features: large, wide-set eyes, elongated heads, broad hips, and often prominent breasts. Some hold infants to their chests. Some sit in postures of offering. The first major collection was excavated at al-Ubaid itself, the type site for the entire period. Beginning in 1919, when Henry Hall of the British Museum first broke ground there, the University of Pennsylvania Museum preserves several of these figurines, described in its own bulletin as archaic feminine clay, figurines of al-Ubaid period with bird-like heads and bitumen wigs. Their shoulders are decorated with painted marks or tattoos. Their eyes slant. Their hair, or what appears to be hair, is rendered in bitumen, the natural tar that seeped from the Mesopotamian earth and was one of the region's most versatile materials. They were found in domestic contexts, in houses, near hearths, in burials. They were not temple objects, at least not in the way we understand temples. They were intimate, personal, the kind of object you keep close because it matters to you in a way that is difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The Ubaid period itself witnessed something remarkable: the transition from scattered agricultural villages to larger, more complex settlements, the first tentative steps toward urbanization. Tel el-Wali, the oldest known Ubaid site in southern Mesopotamia, reveals early signs of organized spirituality, temples, modest yet significant, dotting the landscape. The figurines found there and at other sites suggest what scholars have cautiously described as a nascent reverence for supernatural forces connected to fertility and survival. A specific practice of this period adds another layer of mystery, evidence of cranial modification, deliberate head shaping, has been found at many Ubaid sites throughout wider Mesopotamia. The technique was circumferential, using bands to produce an elongated shape of the head. This practice appears to have reached its peak during the Ubaid period. The figurines with their elongated heads may reflect this cultural practice, though whether they represent deities, ancestors, or idealized human forms remains a matter of scholarly debate. What we can say is this: the figurines exist. They are widespread. They share common features across a large geographic area and a span of more than 2,000 years, and they depict female figures in positions of power, nourishment, and creative authority. When writing eventually emerged and the Sumerian pantheon took its formal shape, the mother goddess figure was already there, fully formed, at the top of the divine hierarchy. The figurines suggest that Ninhursag, or whatever she was called before the Sumerians gave her that name, was not a Sumerian invention. She was an inheritance, a tradition so old that it predated not just writing, but civilization itself. We spoke of Dilman as a paradise, a mythological garden where there was no death, no sickness, no old age. But Dilman was not only a myth, it was also a real place. Most scholars now identify ancient Dilman with the island of Bahrain and the adjacent coastline of eastern Arabia. Archaeological evidence confirms that Dilmun was a significant trading centre as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, serving as a crucial link between the civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. Ships loaded with copper, ivory, semi-precious stones and timber passed through Dilmun's harbours. The identification of Dilmun with Bahrain was strengthened by extensive archaeological work conducted from the 1950s onward, particularly by the Danish archaeological expedition led by P.V. Glob and Geoffrey Bibby. They uncovered elaborate burial mounds, hundreds of thousands of them, covering the landscape in a vast necropolis that remains one of the most striking archaeological features of the island. They uncovered temple complexes and evidence of a sophisticated urban culture that thrived for centuries. Among the finds were circular stamp seals, a distinctive Dilmun art form that depicted scenes of water, vegetation, and divine figures. Some of these seals show what appear to be depictions of the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, a male and female figure surrounded by flowing water and growing plants. If these identifications are correct, the people of Dilmun were not merely the setting of the myth, they were its living practitioners. The fact that the Sumerians chose Dilmun as their paradise is itself significant. They did not choose a fantastical location, a cloud kingdom or an underworld garden. They chose a real place. When the myth says that Enki brought fresh water to Dilmun, it may be describing something the Sumerians actually observed: the natural springs of Bahrain, where fresh groundwater bubbles up through the seafloor. These springs were famous in the ancient world, and they were one of the reasons Dilmun was considered sacred. You can go to Bahrain today. You can see the springs, though many have been depleted by modern development. You can stand on the ground where, 4,000 years ago, people pressed stories into clay about the goddess who created life in a garden by the sea. There is one aspect of Ninhursag's authority that the modern world finds particularly difficult to understand, because it rests on a metaphor so deeply embedded in Sumerian political thought that translating it requires more than just rendering words from one language to another. Ninhursag nursed the kings. This does not mean what a casual reader might assume. In Sumerian political theology, the act of nursing, of receiving sustenance from the goddess who had created humanity in the first place, was one of the most important sources of a king's legitimacy. As Kramer noted, the early Sumerian rulers liked to describe themselves as constantly nourished by Ninhursag with milk. This phrase appears in royal inscriptions, official documents carved in stone and displayed for public view. The king was saying, in effect, "I rule because the mother goddess chose me. My authority flows from her body." If a king's legitimacy depended on the mother goddess, then the temples of the mother goddess were essential political institutions. Her priests and priestesses were not merely religious figures, they were political power brokers. Their endorsement mattered. Their rituals conferred authority. Without the blessing of Ninhursag's temple, a king's claim to the throne was incomplete. This political theology had physical manifestations. Ninhursag had temples in Kesh, in Lagash, in Eridu, in Adab. A ruler named Arnepada, son of Masanapada, a king of the first dynasty of Ur who reigned around the 26th century BCE, built her a temple at Tel al-Ubaid, near Ur. a foundation tablet bearing the inscription for Ninhursag, Anapada, king of Ur, son of Mesanapada, king of Ur, built the temple for Ninhursag, was discovered there in 1919 by Henry Hall, and is now catalogued as BM 116982 in the British Museum. The Kesh Temple Hymn, one of the oldest literary compositions in the world dating to approximately 2600 BCE, was dedicated to her sacred house. Her symbol, a shape resembling the Greek letter omega, appears on boundary stones in the upper tier, indicating her importance among the highest-ranking deities. When Ninhursag's position in the divine hierarchy dropped, kings began to derive their legitimacy from other sources, from the favour of Enlil, from the commission of Marduk, from military victory attributed to male war gods. The act of nursing, the connection between the king's body and the body of the mother goddess, gradually faded from the political vocabulary. But echoes persisted in altered forms. The pharaohs of Egypt were depicted being nursed by divine cow goddesses. At the root was always the same idea Ninhursag had embodied first, that political authority begins with nourishment, and nourishment begins with the mother. If you travel to southern Iraq, to the place where the ancient city of Ur once stood, and if you travel about 7 kilometres to the northwest, you will arrive at a mound called al-Ubaid. It is not a large site. The mound measures approximately 500 metres from north to south, and 300 metres from east to west, rising only about 2 metres above the surrounding plain. But what was found there, beginning in 1919 and continuing into the 1920s, changed our understanding of Ninhursag's significance. The excavations were led initially by H.R. Hall of the British Museum, and later, from 1922 to 1923, by Leonard Woolley. A final examination was conducted by Seton Lloyd and Pinus Delugas of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute during 4 days in January 1937. Hall focused on what turned out to be the temple complex itself, a 50-metre-long outcrop on the northern edge of the mound. The temple Anapada built for Ninhursag was small by the standards of later Mesopotamian architecture, but it was lavishly decorated. Staircases led from the low ground, surrounded by a circular enclosure wall, to an upper platform on which the shrine itself stood. Wooden columns adorned with mosaics of alternating coloured triangles or covered with copper plates framed the entrance door. Above the door hung what is now one of the most famous artefacts of early Mesopotamian art, a large copper relief depicting the Imdugud bird, a lion-headed eagle, the symbol of the god Ninkasi, grasping 2 stags in its talons. This panel, the Tel al-Ubaid copper lintel, had to be heavily restored by conservators after its discovery. It is now in the British Museum. Flanking the entrance were statues of bulls and lions, partly cast in copper, with inlaid eyes and tongues of coloured stone. A frieze showed cattle being milked, cows standing in a row while figures crouched beside them, pulling milk into vessels. A mosaic scene, created from cut limestone figures set against a bitumen background in a copper frame, depicted the same subject, the sacred act of milking, of nourishment, of the flow of sustenance from animal to human, from goddess to world. These artefacts, now divided between the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Iraq Museum, are among the earliest examples of monumental temple decoration in Mesopotamia. They demonstrate that Ninhursag was not merely a name on a tablet. She was the focus of active, elaborate, well-funded worship. A king invested significant resources in building and decorating a temple in her honour. The milking scenes were not decorative. They were theological statements, images of the goddess's primary gift, the sustenance that flows from the mother to those she chooses to nourish. The temple was later rebuilt during the Ur III period. Bricks inscribed with the standard inscription of Shulgi, who reigned from approximately 2094 to 2046 BCE, were found at the southeast end of the outcrop, stamped with the words Shulgi, mighty man, king of Ur, king of the lands of Sumer and Akkad. Even 1,000 years after Anapada first built it, the temple of Ninhursag at Tel al-Ubaid was still considered important enough to rebuild. Within a few centuries after Shulgi, temples of this kind were no longer being built for Ninhursag. The devotional energy was being redirected. The temple at Tel al-Ubaid is a physical record of what was lost, evidence that there was a time when the goddess who created humanity was honoured with the finest art and architecture her civilization could produce. In 2008, An Iraqi-British team surveyed the site as part of an investigation of wartime damage to archaeological sites in Iraq. They reported extensive damage from military installations. The site had been established as an Iraqi command post during the conflicts of the early 2000s. The ancient temple of the Mother Goddess, the oldest monumental sanctuary dedicated to her that archaeologists have found, had been scarred by the machinery of modern war. One of the most distinctive aspects of Ninhursag's mythology, and one that is often overlooked, is her connection to wild animals. In the Sumerian understanding, Ninhursag was not merely the goddess of human birth, she was the goddess of all birth. The wild things of the desert and the mountain, the onages, the gazelles, the wild asses that roamed the steppe, were her children as much as humans were. The Hursag, the mountain and stony ground from which she took her name, was not a gentle place. It was hard country where survival required strength, adaptability, and an intimate knowledge of the land. Stags appear in the facade decorations of her temples. The copper lintel at Tel al-Ubaid shows them grasped in the talons of the Imdugud bird. Deer, bison, and wild goats are mentioned in the Kesh temple hymn in connection with her sacred house. The Kesh temple hymn describes stags gathered in herds at the house, and the goddess herself sitting within like a great dragon. This duality, the nurturer and the wild force, the healer and the judge, the creator of paradise and the goddess of harsh stone ground, is what makes Ninhursag so unlike the later, more simplified goddess figures that would replace her. She was gentle enough to heal a dying god and fierce enough to curse him with death. She created paradise and presided over the wilderness. She shaped the human body and mothered the wild beasts. This complexity may be another reason she was eventually marginalized. A goddess who is only nurturing can be safely contained within the role of Divine Mother. A goddess who is nurturing and wild and creative and destructive and political and cosmic, that goddess cannot be so easily contained, and what cannot be contained must be broken into pieces. Before we trace the marginalization, there is one more story that must be told, because it is in the story of the Great Flood that Ninhursag's grief becomes visible in the record. The flood narrative appears across multiple Mesopotamian tablets, in the Atrahasis Epic, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Eridu Genesis. In all versions, the basic structure is the same. After the creation of humanity, the human population grew, and as it grew, the humans became noisy. The noise disturbed Enlil, who valued order and silence above all things. Enlil tried several times to reduce the human population. He sent plague, he sent famine, he sent drought. Each time, Enki, who had helped create humanity and felt a kind of paternal attachment to them, secretly intervened. He warned his devotee, Atrahasis, and taught him how to organize prayers and offerings to the specific god responsible for each disaster. The strategy of Enki was always indirect, always clever. Address the plague god to lift the plague, address the rain god to end the drought. Each time, the crisis was averted. Enlil grew more and more furious. He convened the assembly of the gods. He proposed the complete destruction of humanity through a flood so vast that no human could survive it. The assembly debated, and the decision was made. The gods were bound by oath. Even Enki, who opposed the plan, was forced to swear that he would not warn any human directly. Enki found a loophole. He did not speak to Atrahasis. He spoke to a reed wall. He addressed the wall of Atrahasis's reed hut, knowing that his devotee was on the other side, listening. He instructed the wall, not the man, to dismantle itself and build a boat. Atrahasis understood. He built the boat. He loaded it with his family, with animals, with the seeds and provisions that would allow life to continue. The Atrahasis text is damaged at the point where the divine assembly debates the flood, so we cannot read Ninhursag's exact words in the council. But what the tablets preserve of the aftermath tells us where she stood. When the waters recede and she sees what has been done, she weeps. She mourns the loss of her creatures. In the version preserved in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the goddess, they're called Belet Ili, cries out in anguish. She compares herself to a woman who has given birth only to see her children destroyed. She blames herself for having spoken in the assembly, for having been part of the decision that led to the catastrophe. The Atrahasis version describes the mother goddess's lips becoming encrusted with rime as the storm raged. She was exposed to the cold, suffering alongside the humans she had made. The Atrahasis version adds a detail that transforms her grief into something more. Ninhursag holds up a great jewelled necklace, the fly jewels that Anu had made, and swears an oath. She swears that she will not forget what happened, that the destruction of her creatures will not be repeated, that this moment will remain a testimony against the gods who allowed it. In a culture that placed enormous importance on oaths and symbols, this was the establishment of a permanent record. She pressed her grief into the story as firmly as a stylus pressed into clay. The gods who chose destruction would be remembered as destroyers, and the goddess who chose mercy would be remembered as the one who wept. What happened to Ninhursag between roughly 2000 BCE and 1200 BCE is one of the most striking transformations in the history of religion. It did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, through a combination of political, theological and textual changes that, taken individually, might seem unremarkable. Taken together, they constitute a systematic dismantling of her position. The Sumerians maintained formal lists of their gods, arranged in hierarchical order. These lists were copied and recopied by scribes over centuries, serving as theological reference documents, the official record of who mattered in the divine world. In the earliest versions, Ninhursag appears near the top. In later versions, particularly those composed during and after the Old Babylonian period, around 2000 to 1600 BCE, her position drops, from the first rank to the second, from the second to the periphery. This was not accidental. The god lists were compiled by temple scribes working under the authority of the ruling administration. A change in the god list reflected a deliberate theological policy. Simultaneously, her identity was being fragmented. Her dozen names began to be treated as if they referred to separate goddesses rather than different aspects of one being. Nintu became a minor birth goddess. Aruru became a vaguely defined creator figure. Ninmah became an obscure title. The connections between these names, the understanding that they all pointed to the same vast, complex deity, dissolved. This was the mechanism Fry Makensky identified. If you cannot directly demote a powerful figure, you can achieve a similar effect by splitting them into fragments. Each fragment is smaller, easier to sideline, and once the fragments are separated, there is no one left who remembers the whole. The political context made this possible. The period between 2000 and 1200 BCE saw a series of dramatic transformations in Mesopotamia. The Sumerian civilization gave way to the Akkadian Empire, then to the third dynasty of Ur, then to a series of competing city-states, and finally to the rise of Babylon under Hammurabi and his successors. Each transition brought changes to the religious landscape. Under Hammurabi, around 1792 to 1750 BCE, female deities across the board began to lose status. The goddess Nisaba, patron of writing and scholarship, was gradually replaced by the male god Nabu. Other goddesses saw their functions absorbed by male counterparts. When power concentrates under a single ruler, and when that ruler is male, and when the legitimacy of his rule is tied to a male god, the entire theological system tends to shift in a patriarchal direction. The gods begin to look like the kings. The divine hierarchy begins to mirror the human one, and then came Marduk. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, was composed sometime around the 12th century BCE. It was written on 7 tablets and recited every year during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration. It is, in many ways, a political document. Its purpose was to explain and justify the supremacy of Marduk over all other gods, and by extension, the supremacy of Babylon over all other cities. And in the Enuma Elish, the creation of humanity has been completely rewritten. In the beginning, there was only water. Tiamat, the goddess of the salt sea, and Apsu, the god of fresh water, mingled their waters together, and from this mingling the gods were born. But the younger gods were noisy and restless, and Apsu decided to destroy them. Ea, the Babylonian form of Enki, killed Apsu first. Tiamat, enraged, raised an army of monsters to avenge her husband. The gods were terrified. They turned to Marduk, the young and mighty son of Ea. Marduk agreed to fight Tiamat, but only on one condition. If he won, he would become supreme ruler of all the gods. They agreed. Marduk armed himself with winds and storms and a great net. He confronted Tiamat. He caught her in his net. When she opened her mouth to devour him, he drove the winds into her throat. He shot an arrow through her body and split her in two. From one half of Tiamat's body he made the sky. From the other half he made the earth. He organized the cosmos, assigned the gods their stations, set the stars in their courses, and then he created humanity. From the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's defeated general, Marduk fashioned the mixed being, the human, created to serve the gods. The parallels to the older Atrahasis account are unmistakable. The creation of humanity from divine blood mixed with earthly material, the purpose of humanity as a labour force for the gods. But notice what is missing. In the Enuma Elish, there is no female co-creator. There is no goddess who holds the mould, shapes the clay, births the first human. Marduk does it alone. The role that Ninhursag played, the role that the oldest tablets describe as essential, has been completely removed. And there is more. The only significant female figure in the Enuma Elish is Tiamat, and Tiamat is not a creator. She is a monster, the enemy, the embodiment of chaos that must be conquered before order can be established. Her body is literally torn apart to make the world. The creative power of the feminine has been split in two. The nurturing, creating aspect has been written out entirely, and the powerful, autonomous aspect, the aspect that could not be removed because the story needed a worthy adversary, has been transformed into a villain. The method of conquest is instructive. Marduk does not persuade Tiamat. He does not negotiate with her. He fills her mouth with wind so she cannot speak. He shoots an arrow through her body. He splits her in two. The silencing is literal. The dismemberment is literal. The Enuma Elish does not acknowledge this as a loss. It presents it as a triumph. But the older tablets existed, somewhere in the archives. The Atrahasis, with its story of Ninhursag shaping the first human and receiving the adoration of the gods. The Enki and Ninmah tablet, with its portrait of two creative equals. The Dilmun myth, with its vision of paradise sustained by the mother goddess. These texts were not destroyed. They were marginalized, pushed to the edges of the scribal curriculum, copied less frequently, stored in less prominent locations. But they survived, and their survival means that we can see both versions of the story, the original and the revision, and understand what was changed and why. To understand how Ninhursag's story was revised, it helps to understand who controlled the tablets. In ancient Mesopotamia, writing was the domain of a specialized class, the scribes. Scribes were trained in formal schools. The Sumerians called them aduba, literally tablet houses, where they spent years mastering the complex cuneiform script. They learned by copying standard texts, and the curriculum was not random, it was curated. The aduba was a private secular institution, a centre of learning and literary creation, established to train scribes for the palace and temple. Not only were the classics copied there, but new works were also composed. The children who attended were overwhelmingly male. They were in most cases the sons of elite families. The scribe class was self-perpetuating, a closed loop of literacy and privilege. Their training followed a prescribed path. Students began by learning the basic shapes of the cuneiform signs, copying wedge patterns until their hands developed the muscle memory required for speed and precision. They graduated to syllable lists, then vocabulary lists, then mathematical tables, then contracts and administrative documents. Only after years of this foundational work did they begin copying literary texts, the myths, the hymns, the epics that formed the intellectual core of Sumerian civilization. The texts that scribes were trained to copy were, by definition, the texts that the ruling authorities wanted preserved. If a text was in the curriculum, it would be copied hundreds of times over centuries, ensuring its survival. If a text was removed from the curriculum, it would gradually disappear, not immediately but slowly, generation by generation, as fewer copies existed and fewer scribes knew the text well enough to reproduce it. Sumerian language and literature continued to dominate the school curriculum until about 1000 BCE, long after Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language. This meant that scribes in Babylon and Assyria were still copying Sumerian texts in a language they did not speak natively, for centuries after the civilization that produced those texts had vanished. The texts survived, but they survived in translation, in adaptation, in the interpretive framework of people who were not Sumerians. When the theological priority shifted from the mother goddess to male deities, the scribal curriculum shifted with it. The Enuma Elish became a standard text, copied and recopied throughout Babylonia. The Atrahasis, which gave Ninhursag a central role, was still copied, but less widely, less frequently. The Sippar library tablets, recently published by scholars working with British Museum collections, have provided nearly complete versions of the standard Babylonian Atrahasis, showing that it continued to be copied. But it was no longer the primary creation narrative taught to every scribe. This is how cultural memory works in a literate society. It is not enough to have a story written down. The story must be actively copied, taught, transmitted. If the copying slows, the story begins to fade. Not immediately, but over centuries, like a signal growing weaker as the transmitter loses power. When Ninhursag faded from the Mesopotamian tablets, the functions she represented, creation, birth, healing, the earth, the sacred mountain, were too fundamental to human experience to disappear. Instead, they re-emerged in new forms, under new names, in new civilizations. In Egypt, the goddess Isis took on many of the mother goddess functions that Ninhursag had embodied: healer, nurturer, the one who reassembled the broken body of Osiris and breathed life back into him. Her story of restoring the shattered male deity echoes the Dilman narrative in its central dynamic. A goddess who alone has the power to heal, who must be sought out, who chooses to restore what has been broken. In Anatolia, the goddess Cybele, the great mother of the Romans, carried forward the tradition of the mountain goddess. Her worship centered on sacred mountains. Her name may derive from the same conceptual root as the sacred mountain in Sumerian thought. The Romans adopted her as Magna Mater, and her worship spread across the empire. In the Vedic tradition of India, Aditi was called the mother of all gods. Boundless, infinite, the cosmic principle from which all creation emerged. In the Aztec world, Coatlicue was the earth goddess who gave birth to the moon, the stars, and the war god, both terrifying and nurturing, both creative and destructive. These are not all the same goddess. Each figure emerged from her own cultural context, her own mythological tradition. But the pattern is worth noticing. Across nearly every major civilization, a mother goddess figure appears at or near the origin of creation. She's associated with the earth, with birth, with healing. And in nearly every case over time she is displaced by male deities who take over her functions while her own role is diminished. Whether these figures are all independent inventions or share deeper connections is a question scholars of comparative religion have debated for over a century. But if there is a common impulse, an instinct to understand creation through the figure of a mother, a shaper, the earliest written evidence we have of it points to one figure, Ninhersag. There is a passage in the book of Genesis that has puzzled theologians for centuries. It occurs in the very first chapter, in the account of the creation of humanity. God says, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." Us. Our. The Hebrew word used for God in this passage is Elohim. It is a plural form. Elohim grammatically means gods, not God, and yet it is used to describe the creator of the universe. There have been many explanations. Some theologians interpret the plural as a royal we, others see a reference to the Trinity. Others suggest it reflects the influence of the earlier polytheistic traditions from which the Hebrew Bible emerged. That last interpretation is the one that interests us here. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, and the Babylonians told creation stories in which humanity was made not by one god, but by two, Enki and Ninhursag, a male and a female, working together. The Atrahasis is explicit. The creation of humanity required both of them. If the writers of Genesis were drawing on these older Mesopotamian traditions, and the parallels are extensive and well documented, then the plural us may carry within it a trace of the older story. The story in which creation was a partnership. The story in which the female creator was present, standing beside the male god, holding the clay. This is not a claim that can be proven, it is a possibility that scholars have explored. But the possibility itself is significant, because it suggests that even in the most famous creation account in the world, there may be a faint, nearly invisible echo of the goddess who was written out. There is one more trace worth examining, a trace hidden in a name. In the Hebrew Bible, one of the oldest titles used for God is El Shaddai. It is traditionally translated as God Almighty, but the etymology of the word Shaddai has been debated for centuries. Some scholars derive it from the Hebrew root shaddad, meaning to overpower or to destroy. This is the dominant traditional interpretation. But Harriet Lutsky, in a detailed philological analysis published in Vetus Testamentum in 1998, volume 48, pages 15 through 36, presented evidence that Shaddai was originally an attribute of a Semitic goddess, specifically linking the epithet with the Hebrew word shad, meaning breast, and connecting it to the goddess Asherah. W. F. Albright, decades earlier, had proposed a complementary derivation, connecting Shaddai to the Akkadian word shadu, meaning mountain. Now consider Ninhursag's titles. She was the lady of the sacred mountain. She was the goddess who nursed kings at her breast. Mountain, breast, feminine creative power. These are the very attributes that define the oldest mother goddess in Mesopotamian religion. Neither Lutsky nor Albright was making a direct claim about Ninhursag. Their arguments concerned the Semitic and Canaanite traditions that fed into the Hebrew Bible. But the convergence of themes is worth sitting with quietly. It is possible, though far from proven, that when the earliest Hebrews invoked El Shaddai, they were drawing on a reservoir of sacred language that had been accumulating for millennia, passing through Sumerian, Akkadian, Canaanite, and finally Hebrew hands, transformed at each stage but never fully emptied of its original meaning. We cannot know for certain, but the question itself is the trace. There is one more figure who deserves mention, not Ninhursag herself, but someone who carried the tradition of divine feminine power forward in one of the most remarkable literary acts of the ancient world. Her name was Inheduana. Inheduana was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the king who built the first known empire in history, roughly 2334 to 2279 BCE. Sargon appointed Enheduana as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna at the Great Temple in Ur. It was a political appointment, but Enheduana made it something more. She became a writer, the first named author in all of human history. Enheduana composed a cycle of hymns to the temples of Sumer and Akkad, 42 temples, each praised in turn. She wrote passionate, complex devotional poetry, most notably to the goddess Inanna, not to Ninhursag directly. It is important to be precise here. Her great works celebrate Inanna, the goddess of love, war and power, not the mother goddess. But in writing about Inanna as terrifying and tender, creative and destructive, a force that demanded recognition and could not be contained, Enheduana gave voice to a tradition of divine feminine authority that Ninhursag had embodied in mythological form for centuries before Enheduana was born. The two goddesses are not the same figure, but the tradition they share, the insistence that feminine power is real, consequential, and not to be subordinated, runs through both of their stories. That the first-named author in human history was a woman writing about the power of a goddess is a window into a world where the divine feminine was not marginal, but central. A world already beginning to change in Enheduana's own time. She was removed from her priestly position during a political upheaval and had to fight to be restored. But that still recognized the creative power of women, both human and divine. Consider the parallel. Enheduana is the first known author. Ninhursag is the first known creator. Both are female. Both left marks on clay that were intended to last. Both were pushed to the margins by forces that preferred the contributions of men, and both, against considerable odds, survived. Of all the cities associated with Ninhursag, none was more important than Kesh. The patron goddess of Kesh was Ninhursag, or more precisely Ninhursag in her aspect as Nintud, the birth goddess. The Kesh temple hymn, dating to approximately 2600 BCE, is dedicated to her sacred house there. The exact location of Kesh remains uncertain. Some scholars, such as Robert D. Biggs, have suggested it might be a variant spelling of the more famous city of Kish. Others identify it with Tel al-Wilaya near Adab, or with Abu Salabih. The scholarly consensus now leans toward Kesh being a distinct city, though its ruins have not been definitively identified. What is not in doubt is its religious significance. The Kesh temple hymn, preserved on tablets found at Nippur and Abu Salabih, describes Ninhursag's temple in language of extraordinary grandeur. The temple is compared to a princely barge floating in the heavens, a platform whose foundations are fixed in the Abzu. The hymn describes the goddess sitting within like a great dragon. The Kesh sanctuary was the centre of Ninhursag's cult from the 30th century BCE to about the 17th century BCE, over 1,000 years of continuous primary worship. Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, rebuilt her temple at Kesh, calling it her favourite temple. When that base declined, so did the last major stronghold of her cult. The loss was not merely theological, it was institutional. When the temple lost its prominence, the priesthood that sustained her worship, the rituals that conferred her blessing, the political connections that depended on her patronage, all of these declined as well. There is one more textual appearance of Ninhursag that deserves attention, because it appears in the most famous work of literature to come out of ancient Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide that the city of Uruk needs a counterpart for its overbearing king, someone who can match his strength, temper his arrogance, someone who is not born of human parents, but shaped from the raw stuff of the world. The gods turn to Aruru, to Ninhursag, under one of her oldest names. And what does she do? She takes clay, she wets it with her spit, she shapes it with her hands, and she creates Enkidu, the wild man, the creature of the steppe, the being who will become Gilgamesh's companion, his brother, the love of his life. The language mirrors the older creation text precisely. Clay, moisture, hands. The same materials, the same process, the same goddess. When the most important story in Mesopotamian literature needed someone to create a new being from scratch, it could not avoid naming her. And the being she creates is not a servant or a tool. Enkidu is wild and free, a creature of the grasslands, running with the gazelles, drinking from the watering holes alongside the herds. He's one of Ninhursag's wild children, the onagers and the deer made human, half civilization, half wilderness, the creation of a goddess who understood both worlds because she presided over both. But the Gilgamesh epic preserves more than just this cameo. It also preserves, in its flood narrative, Tablet 11, the passage we discussed earlier, in which the mother goddess weeps for the destruction of humanity. The fact that the Epic of Gilgamesh, a text that was copied more widely than almost any other in the ancient Near East, that survived in multiple languages across multiple centuries, contains both of these moments is significant. It means that even as the theological establishment was marginalizing the mother goddess, the literary tradition continued to include her. The storytellers remembered what the scribal curriculum was beginning to forget. There is something quietly subversive about that. The most popular story in ancient Mesopotamia still gave her a speaking part, still showed her creating life, still let her weep publicly for the death of the creatures she had made. The theologians could revise the god lists. The priests could redirect worship to Marduk. But the storytellers kept slipping her name back in. Let us spend a moment thinking about clay itself, because clay is not merely the medium of this story, it is the metaphor at its heart. Clay is patient, it waits. You can take it from the riverbank where it has been sitting for centuries, and it will yield to your hands as readily as if it had been waiting for you specifically. It does not resist. It accepts the impression of whatever touches it, a reed stylus, a cylinder seal, a thumb, a tool. But clay is also persistent. Once it has received an impression and been baked, or even just dried in the Mesopotamian sun, it holds that impression with a tenacity that defies the passage of time. Paper burns, parchment rots, stone erodes, but fired clay can survive for 10,000 years, the marks pressed into it remain sharp, the words remain legible, the names remain readable, and when the scribes of the Atrahasis sat down to record the creation of humanity, they described the creator goddess taking clay and shaping it with her hands. The medium of the record was the same as the medium of creation. The story was told in the very substance from which, according to the story, human beings were made. The Sumerians would have appreciated this circularity. They were a culture that paid close attention to connections between words, between things, between the names of objects and the natures of the objects themselves. The act of writing and the act of creating were related activities. To press a stylus into clay was, in some fundamental way, an echo of the first pressing, the pressing of divine hands into the clay of the earth to give form to the first human being, and those divine hands belonged to Ninhersag. For more than 2,000 years, no living person on earth could read cuneiform. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets were visible to anyone who happened to dig them up, but their meaning was as inaccessible as the surface of the moon. The scribes who had created them were gone. The languages they represented had not been spoken in centuries. The tablets sat in the ground in the museum cases of early collectors, on the shelves of Victorian antiquarians. Silent, patient, waiting. The breakthrough began not with Sumerian but with Old Persian. At the site of Behistun, in what is now western Iran, a massive inscription carved into a cliff face by the Persian king Darius I, in the 5th century BCE caught the attention of a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson. The inscription was written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. By working from the Old Persian, Rawlinson and other scholars gradually worked their way toward the Babylonian script, which used the same cuneiform writing system as the much older Sumerian texts. The Sumerian language itself was an isolate, unrelated to the Semitic languages of the region or to any other known language family. Progress was slow. The first Sumerian literary texts were not translated with confidence until the early 20th century. The story of the Atrahasis itself illustrates the difficulty. The fragments were first assembled and identified by George Smith, the same George Smith who famously discovered the flood narrative in the Gilgamesh tablets, and, according to legend, was so excited that he began removing his clothing in the reading room of the British Museum. Smith published his findings as the Chaldean account of Genesis in 1876. But it was not until 1965 that Wilfred G. Lambert and Alan Millard published the comprehensive edition of the Atrahasis based on the old Babylonian tablets, including the crucial creation passages that describe Ninhursag's role. This means that the full picture of Ninhursag's role did not become clear until remarkably recently. Kramer's Sumerian mythology was published in 1944, Jacobson's Treasures of Darkness in 1976, Freimakensky's In the Wake of the Goddesses in 1992. The detailed work that allowed us to see the pattern of her marginalization has largely been done within living memory. We are only the 2nd or 3rd generation of human beings since the Sumerians themselves to know what those tablets actually say. For thousands of years, the oldest creation story in the world, the story in which a female goddess shaped the first human body from clay, was buried in the ground, waiting. And it is only now that it has been made available for people like you and me to hear. Marginalization is never complete. No matter how thorough the effort, something always survives. Consider Ninhursag's symbol on Sumerian artifacts, cylinder seals, boundary stones, temple reliefs. A shape appears again and again in connection with her. It resembles the Greek letter omega. Sometimes it adorns her headdress or is mounted atop a staff she carries. Sometimes it is carved into boundary stones on the upper tier, indicating her high importance. The meaning of this symbol has been debated. Some scholars interpret it as a representation of the uterus, which would align with her role as the goddess of birth. According to Johanna Stuckey, the symbol has been depicted in art from approximately 3000 BCE. Others, including Joan Goodnick Westenholz and Julia M. Asher-Grieve, have argued that it should be understood as a schematic representation of a woman's hair, rather than the shape of a uterus. What is not debated is the symbol's antiquity and its consistent association with Ninhursag. It appears on artifacts that predate the Greek alphabet by over 2,000 years. Whether it carried its original meaning into later contexts is uncertain. There is no clear, documented chain of transmission. But the shape itself endured in the visual vocabulary of the ancient Near East, a mute testament to the goddess it once identified. Let us pause here to consider the scale of time we're dealing with. The Ubaid period figurines, the earliest physical evidence we have for the veneration of a mother goddess figure in Mesopotamia, date to approximately 6,500 BCE at the earliest sites. The last tablets that give Ninhursag a prominent role in the creation narrative date to roughly 1700 BCE. That is a span of nearly 5,000 years during which the mother goddess was continuously venerated in one form or another across the region. 5,000 years. The entire span of Christian history covers about 2,000 years. The entire history of Islam covers about 1400. The Roman Empire, from its legendary founding to the fall of its western half, covers about 1200 years. Ninhursag's tradition outlasted all of them, combined, and then some. Even after her demotion, even after the Enuma Elish replaced her with Marduk, her worship did not immediately cease. Evidence from the first millennium BCE shows that the mother goddess, under various names, continued to receive offerings and prayers. She was diminished, but not dead. The final disappearance came only with the general decline of Mesopotamian religion in the late first millennium BCE, as the region came under successive waves of Persian, Greek, and eventually Roman rule. By the time of Christ, the old Mesopotamian gods had all been largely forgotten, not just Ninhursag, but all of them. But Ninhursag had already been fading for over 1,000 years by then. She was among the first of the great deities to lose her supreme position. the first sign that the old balance was breaking. There is one more thread to follow before we come to the end, a thread that connects the ancient world to the present in a way that most histories of Mesopotamia never mention. The marshlands of southern Iraq, the same marshlands that surrounded the earlier Sumerian cities, that provided the reeds for writing styluses and the fish for temple offerings, and the water that sustained the first civilization, those marshlands still existed in something close to their ancient form until very recently. The marsh Arabs, the Madan, lived in the marshes of southern Iraq for thousands of years, building houses from the same giant reeds that grew in the time of the Sumerians. Their reed architecture, their water-based way of life, their methods of fishing and cattle raising bore striking resemblances to the scenes depicted on cylinder seals and temple reliefs from the 3rd millennium BCE. The British explorer Wilfred Thesiger, who lived among the Madan in the 1950s, documented a way of life that seemed to have been continuous in its essential features for 5,000 years. In the 1990s, the marshlands were deliberately drained, the channels were diverted, the water was cut off. Within a few years, one of the oldest continuously inhabited ecosystems on Earth had been turned to dust. The reeds died, the waterbirds vanished, the Madan were displaced. After 2003, some restoration efforts began. Water was allowed to flow back into parts of the marshes. Reeds began to grow again. Some families returned. But the marshes have not recovered their former extent, and the way of life that Thesiger documented is largely gone. The destruction of the marshes was not connected to Ninhursag in any direct, intentional way. But the resonance is difficult to ignore. The landscape she presided over, the water world of reeds and rivers and alluvial mud that had given birth to writing, to cities, to the very concept of civilization, was itself dismantled. The physical world that had sustained her memory, the world where her temples had stood and her stories had first been told, was taken apart. And yet the tablets remained. In London, in Philadelphia, in Oxford, in Baghdad. The clay survived what the water could not. Set down the evidence now, let the tablets rest. What does this story say about us? Not about Ninhersag, about us. About what it means to be a species that tells creation stories. About what it means to inherit a world shaped by choices we did not make and revisions we did not authorize. The Sumerians understood something that we have largely forgotten, that the stories we tell about our origins shape the way we live. If the creation story says that humanity was made by a partnership between male and female, then the society that tells that story will organize itself around the idea of partnership. If the creation story says that humanity was made by a single male god, then the society that tells that story will organize itself differently. The revision of the creation narrative, the removal of the female creator, was not merely a theological exercise. It was a political act with consequences that echoed across millennia. It shaped the way subsequent civilizations understood authority, creativity, and the relationship between the sexes. It influenced the stories that were told, the gods that were worshipped, the rights that were granted, the voices that were heard. And all of it began with a choice made by scribes in Babylon 3,000 years ago, to tell the creation story differently than their predecessors had told it. But here is the thing about clay. It is honest. It preserves what was pressed into it, regardless of what was pressed into it later. The older version does not vanish just because a newer version was composed. Both exist. Both can be read. And the gap between them, the difference between the story that was told first and the story that replaced it, is itself a kind of evidence of a choice, evidence of what was gained and what was lost. What was gained was political consolidation, a unified religious narrative, a simpler, more streamlined cosmos with a clear hierarchy and a single supreme god. What was lost was a creation story in which making required two, in which the shaping of human life was understood as a collaborative act between masculine and feminine principles, in which a goddess could be fierce and tender, creative and destructive, nurturing and wild, all at once without contradiction, without apology, without needing to be simplified into something safer. That story has been recovered. Not fully. There are still gaps in the tablets, still passages too damaged to read, still questions that will never be answered. But enough has been recovered to see the shape of what was there, to know that it existed, to know that it was changed, and to ask whether the change was inevitable. or whether the older vision, the vision of creation as partnership, might have something to offer the world that the revision left behind. That is not a question this story can answer. It is a question this story can only ask. The Sumerians had lullabies. They are among the oldest recorded songs in human history. The earliest known lullaby, according to Samuel Noah Kramer, was composed for a son of Shulgi, a ruler of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, sometime around 2000 BCE. It may have been written by his wife, a queen singing to a sick child in the dark. The lullaby was pressed into clay, like everything else in Sumer, and the words, translated across 4,000 years, sound like this: "Sleep come, sleep come, sleep come to my son. Put to sleep his restless eyes, put your hand on his sparkling eyes. As for his murmuring tongue, let the murmuring not spoil his sleep. A mother, a child, the dark, and sleep itself, personified, invited into the room like a guest, asked to lay its hand gently on the child's eyes, asked to quiet the small restless sounds that keep the child from rest. The lullaby continues, wishing for the child's future. May he grow stout of root like a tree. May he grow broad of crown. May he marry. May he have children of his own. The mother imagines the whole of a life that has barely begun, and presses it into clay so that the wish might last. We do not know which of Shulgi's sons this lullaby was for. Some scholars have suggested it may have been a Marsuen, who died young from a scorpion bite. If so, the mother's wishes went unfulfilled. The child she sang to did not grow old. The future she imagined did not arrive. But the song survived. The wishes survived. The words that were meant to last only as long as it took a child to fall asleep have lasted 4,000 years. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you're doing something very old. Something as old as writing, as old as cities, as old as the first people who ever pressed a reed into wet clay and tried to make the moment last. We began with a name that was quietly lowered in the lists, written out of the most famous versions, fragmented across a dozen identities until the whole was forgotten. Let us end by asking whether they succeeded. The older tablets survived. The clay that held her story proved more durable than the revisions. The fragments of her identity have been painstakingly reassembled by scholars who devoted their lives to the task. Thorkild Jacobsen traced the evolution. Samuel Noah Kramer translated the texts. Tikvar Frey-Makensky analysed the pattern. Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard published the Atrahasis in something approaching completeness. Stephanie Daly produced the composite translation that made the texts accessible to a wider audience. And the picture that emerged, a goddess who stood at the very top of the oldest pantheon in the world, who co-created humanity, who presided over paradise, who healed the gods when they were dying, who argued for mercy when the assembly voted for destruction. That picture is now available to anyone who wants to see it. The Atrahasis tablet sits in the British Museum, Gallery 56. You can look at it. The Enki and Ninmah tablet sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The Tel al-Ubaid copper lintel with its stags and its lion-headed eagle stands restored behind glass in London. The milking frieze, with its cattle and its figures crouching beside them, is divided between 3 museums on 2 continents. The evidence is there. Somewhere in a museum case, a tablet sits in silence. The marks on its surface are 4,000 years old. They were pressed into the clay by a hand that has been dust for 40 centuries, and they say, in a language that no one has spoken aloud for 2,000 years, the name of the goddess who shaped the first human body from the earth itself. That tablet has outlasted empires, it has outlasted religions, it has outlasted the very civilization that created it, and it will outlast us too. But tonight, for this 1 hour, the signal found you. The name passed from the clay to the scholar, to the page, to the voice, to your ears. The chain is unbroken. The transmission continues. Ninhersag. She's not a historical figure in the way we usually mean. She's not a woman who once lived and was forgotten. She's a concept, a set of ideas about creation, about the female body, about the relationship between the earth and the living things that grow from it, expressed in the language of divinity because that was the language available to the people who first articulated it. But she is also a name, a specific name, written in a specific script, on specific tablets, by specific people, at specific times, and now, so do you. The oldest known lullaby begins, Sleep come, sleep come, sleep come to my son. It was written in a world where the mother goddess still had a temple in every city, where the act of singing a child to sleep was understood as an echo of the divine act of creation, where the clay that recorded the song was the same clay from which, according to the oldest story, humanity was made. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you are doing something as ancient as any act in human culture. You are closing your eyes, you are letting go of the waking world, you are trusting that someone, something, will hold you while you're gone. Let that be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. Not a question, not a debate, just a name. The oldest name for the being who shaped humanity from the clay of the earth. The name that survived anyway, Ninhursag. If this story stayed with you, if it carried you even partway toward rest, helps more than you might think. It tells us that the quiet stories, the deep stories, the stories that don't shout still find the people they were meant for. There is a playlist waiting, more ancient mysteries, more forgotten names, more stories that unfold in the dark like constellations you didn't know were there. Let the next one carry you the rest of the way. And if something in tonight's journey sparked a thought, a question, a connection, a feeling you couldn't quite name, leave it in the comments. This community is built on curiosity. Your thoughts make it richer. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, and sleep well and dream deep, good night.